Welcome to Evan the Counselor Live. I'm Evan the Counselor. Wow, do we have an episode for you? So, I've been wanting to talk to this guy for a very long time about this topic, and it is one of the most interesting, pertinent, and also sensitive topics right now, and that is about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I thought he would be a great person to speak with because he is the vice president in that department at Hamline University in St. Paul, back where I live. And we pretty much covered every topic I wanted to talk about. And we even went into some political territories talking about things like cancel culture, college admissions, and it was so cool to be able to have one of these conversations, especially within the lens of intersectionality. And personally, I learned so much, and I think it was such a great conversation. So I really want you all to check this out. And without further ado, Dr. David Everett. Oh, and one more quick thing. Dr. Everett and I met because we're both working for this startup app, and they contracted me to make some videos for them, and same with him. But the app is called Cadre, and it just opened up, and it's all about coaching, wellness. There's live streams on it, a lot of different videos from different creators, whether it's mental health, nutrition, organization, financial, and then a lot of those creators, you could see them as coaches if you want as well. So since it's new right now, I could get you all on the app for free. It's called Cadre. You could use the code EvanTC23 and feel free to email me about it, but you should be able to find it in the App Store. It's an awesome app, and since it's new again, we're giving it out for free, so check it out. Check it out. All right, Dr. David Everett, welcome to the show. How you doing?
Doing well. How are you, my good man?
Good, good. I'm just live from Sydney, Australia. It's a rainy day. Got huge waves I'm looking at. So I'm stuck
You're
inside.
living the dream. You're living the dream that most of us only get to dream about.
It's true. I'm living in like a beach motel, but other than that, I'm living it up pretty good. It's
Good for you.
hard to find housing here, but yeah. So what's going on? So you're in Minnesota, my
Yep.
home area.
Yep. We had a balmy 40-degree day today, so it was good. You only maybe needed a nice vest and a long sleeve shirt. So hopefully we turn the corner. I think we're supposed to get a little bit of rain tomorrow, but rain is better than snow as long as it doesn't freeze. So there you go.
I remember that. Yeah, it's like warm and then it rains and then you're like, okay. And then like the next day it freezes and you're literally just an ice skating rink and people.
Exactly.
And like at least 3 people that have like fallen and like broken a bone next day. You know, it's not just like elderly people. It's like,
right. It's just like, yep. And you see, cars on the highway sliding into the median and all that kind of good stuff too. So we'll see.
Yeah, thus is Minnesota. But yeah, I really appreciate you coming on. I mean, I think this is such an important topic, and like I said before we started this, and I'm like really curious about picking your brain about some of this, and I think so. I'm really excited to chat with you. But I think just to start off, maybe just a brief overview of like who you are and your background, and what got you interested in the topic you specialize in.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I really came to this diversity, equity, and inclusion space organically. So, several years ago, late 90s, early 2000s, I was into grassroots organizing, doing things on different campaigns in terms of bringing folks, get out to vote efforts, all of those kinds of things, from urban neighborhoods to suburban areas, and making sure organizations were able to build partnerships based on resources or lack thereof. And going through some of that work, really started to see how different entities and different institutions either approached things differently or understood each other differently. And even though there were legitimate attempts at collaboration and working together, they just always seemed to kind of pass each other and not necessarily connect in a really constructive way. So I think that was my first introduction to how difference works, and how different experiences and different expectations, really do lead to different outcomes and different realities. And so, wanting to, I guess maybe delve more into that. That's when I think really first started to understand the term diversity. Uh, Even though back then it really wasn't a popular term, right? It was still more about affirmative action, back then a little bit more. And then, diversity started to evolve a little bit more. And so, did a few, formal things from a position standpoint in government and state government. Obviously, I had teaching experience on a number of levels, community college, 4-year institutions, and then actually got into, formal diversity, equity, and inclusion roles. And so I think where my experience, I don't want to say maybe started to take shape, but really started to be a little bit more uh, robust is, being able to bring all of that experience from grassroots organizing and some of those nonprofit roles into the DEI work, and being able to then, think about application and making some of those transitions into more of the institutional kinds of ways and practices with policies and processes and practices. So I think it's a combination of the two, right? So having that kind of organic grassroots beginning, coupled with, some of the formal positions and trainings and education and all of those other kinds of things, and then being able to think about it in a both and kind of way to move it forward. So that's kind of my journey. And now, obviously I'm still in higher ed as an administrator who focuses on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and tries to, in every way that I possibly can, challenge the institution to be better in ways that really impact people. And and whether those be, staff, students, faculty, community, all of the stakeholders, when you start to think about what makes a community and all of its, flourishing parts.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because I was gonna ask you, yeah, about your current role. So, yeah, I mean, so what's your educational background?
So I have a 2-year degree from Monroe Community College, and that was liberal arts based. And then a 4-year degree in business administration, and then a master's degree in leadership, and then a doctorate in leadership.
Oh, awesome. And so right now you're at Hamline in,
Correct.
Minneapolis, and that's a
St. Paul.
oh, yeah, St. Paul, and that's, just so people who don't know, it's like a, smaller private.
Small liberal arts private institution, the first institution in the state of Minnesota,
Is it really?
the first university in the state of Minnesota. Yep.
Even before University of Minnesota?
Even before the U of M. Yep.
Oh, that's cool. That's a good claim to fame.
Hmm.
So, well, yeah, so what does, like, a day-to-day, like, look like for you?
Yeah, it typically depends. So there's some interaction, obviously, on a number of levels. I, whether I might be teaching a class in the morning, and then may have meetings and thinking about programs or co-curricular programs throughout the rest of the day. Could be some planning sessions in terms of thinking about opportunities for students outside of the campus. So whether it be uh, taking in and taking on some grant writing and looking at that, whether it be thinking about some institutional partnerships and things on that level. And then obviously, some of the, the internal things in terms of making sure there's good interaction and engagement on campus. So hosting forums and community conversations and things of that nature, making sure, some of the more interesting topics or more prevalent topics are being engaged by our community, and making sure I'm fostering some of those types of engagement opportunities.
It's awesome. Yeah, very
Mhm.
cool. So, yeah, I guess I didn't realize, so you do teach some classes, you're like a professor in some of those
Mhm.
courses?
Yep. So I teach a first year seminar which obviously is exactly what it sounds like. So incoming students all have to take a first year seminar. And then depending on, what happens in that first year or that first semester, there could be a follow-up course or there could be some leadership courses, from second, third, fourth years.
For sure. Yeah, and I guess I'm curious too, just kind of getting the background. Like, is there anything from, just like who you are? Like, I guess I don't know much about your stuff, and just like a background too. Is like you and I both, are working together, in a wellness app startup, and that's how we met. So I've gotten to know you a little bit, but I guess, yeah, I guess I never heard about, your history or like, are you from Minnesota or like, what are some?
No, I'm originally from upstate New York. So I am the product of a single parent, non-traditional home in upstate New York, Rochester. And so, yeah, my mom had me when she was 17 and constantly worked 2 or 3 jobs, probably from the time I was 5 or 6 years old. So I was pretty much a latchkey kid, um, raised by, the recreation center or recreation centers and all of those other kinds of things that most cities had for kids to kind of try to stay productive and not get into trouble, while at the same time, doing what you could in school and and having school activities. So very, uh, very independent growing up, lots of responsibility, um, and at the same time, still being able to enjoy, childhood in terms of being able to, play basketball or hang out or, do summer things, like camp and all of those other kinds of activities. So, and then from there, obviously, ended up going to undergraduate in Kentucky. So went to Kentucky State University right from Rochester, New York. And then following undergrad came straight to Minnesota from Kentucky. So went from north to south and then from south back up to north.
For sure. And what brought you to Minnesota? Was it for to work at Hamline or was?
No, so it was a job with company called the Travelers and Insurance Company.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that was my first job out of undergrad. And so I had planned to be in Minnesota for about 2 years because that's what the counseling center always tells you to do, get your first job,
Hmm.
get a little 2 year experience, and then, make some moves. And I made some moves, but it didn't take me anywhere outside of Minnesota. So two has turned into 20 plus.
So yeah, being a VP of DEI at Hamlin and Travelers Insurance is a little bit different, huh?
Yeah, a little bit different, a little bit different.
I guess what has changed? Because like everything seems to be political now. And so have you noticed a change in kind of like what DEI initiatives look like versus even like a couple years ago? Um, and where does that play in?
I don't think there's been much change fundamentally in terms of DEI programming or DEI initiatives. What I think has changed for the most part is the social media component and how some of that either gets portrayed or how it gets relayed in terms of some of those kinds of things. But fundamentally, I don't think DEI as a construct has really changed much. If anything, what has changed has probably been a little bit more expansive to basically be more inclusive of other groups. That so it isn't just about racial. It isn't just about gender. It isn't just about some of those main kind of group emphasis where some of the things that has changed in society has been the addition or at least the acknowledgement of so many other groups and in their own identity makeups and their own identity formations and understanding. So that's made it, I think, a little bit more expansive. But in terms of core construct and what the emphasis should be and what the focus is on, I don't think that's changed much at all over the years.
Yeah, it's interesting. And one of the things I was curious about too. So like in my world and, mental health, therapy, psychology, there's different camps, or there's different like theoretical orientations that view the problem in a different way, or view the solution in a different way, whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy or motivational interviewing. They take roughly the same problem, and but they view it differently, have different solutions. Maybe they don't agree. They have various research that they cite to back up why their model is right. You have therapists that are, I'm a CB, some are kind of more like myself, a little more eclectic, but like I focus more on trauma and EMDR and this, and I believe that this is more important in people's thoughts. And is there something similar like that in DEI? Like, are there
Yeah.
different models, and how do you?
Interesting question. Um, I wouldn't say that there are different models, but I would say there may be different approaches. And why I make that distinction is because at the end of the day, you're either going to come down to two camps. You're either going to have an emphasis or focus on individual behavior, or you're going to focus or have an emphasis on institutional capacity. Um, I'm from the school of thought that it should be a both and, not an either or,
Sure.
right? And so how do you talk about and think about both collectively? And the timing of that might look like there's a primary need to focus on individual behavior initially, but at some point, ideally, maybe you get to some of the institutional kinds of things, or it could be the other way as well. So that's usually what you might see in terms of a distinction from an approach standpoint. But at the end of the day, it usually involves one or the other or both, and there's not too much. Uh, there's not too much more to it than that in terms of approaches. You're either going to, again, think about capacity and competency individually or separately, excuse me,
Yeah.
or you're going to think about them collectively.
And what are some of the goals? Like, what are some are there like measurable goals that in some of these?
Yeah, it depends, right? Yeah. So, as an organization, you could have a goal that, we are going to, have an increase in diversity hiring by a certain percentage, in a certain time frame, right? So what does it look like from a diversity hiring standpoint? So that could be a goal. You could have a goal of reducing the number of DEI complaints or issues. That could be a goal. What I think is a good goal is, how are folks feeling as it relates to, engaging in DEI work and in that space in their respective roles. So you can have that as a goal, right? What does it look like for us to be uh, becoming more competent and building capacity as it relates to DEI topics and those kinds of things. So you can have a number of areas that you want to identify, but I think it's also very important to know and to note, what are you in a position to do, and what does that look like in terms of short term and long term. And so you may not be in a position as an organization to address some of the things because of your capacity right now, right? And so, you may scale back and tackle some of the low hanging fruit, and then kind of build your way up to getting some of the higher hanging fruit.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Because I was looking up at there's, again, this is just me doing a little internet sleuthing or whatever, but like, they talk about like something like the diversity management model, or the cultural competence, intersectional, social identity model, allyship model. Are those like things that are like philosophies within it, or is that just something I Googled randomly?
Oh, I mean, I think philosophy is a strong word, but maybe approaches, right? So you could have, you know, some of the cultural competency, approaches, and again, that's really all about building how folks understand culture, both for and of themselves, as well as for and as it relates to others, right? So, what does it look like for me to understand more about where Evan might be coming from based on Evan's experiences and expectations?
Mhm.
And then how does that impact me in terms of my own experiences and expectations being in that same space with Evan? right? So there's that. Um, and some of the other kind of tangible things as it relates to equipping people. What are we thinking are great capacity pillars to have for folks? And so whether it's a tool like the intercultural development inventory, or whether it's the implicit association test, the IAT, or some of those kinds of things that really help you kind of unpack more about yourself. And so the more that you can become a little bit more self-aware, hopefully that leads to opportunities to then think about how that relates and affects engagement with other folks, particularly other folks who might not be that much similar to yourself.
Yeah. So like kind of like doing like implicit bias tests and that
Mhm.
kind of thing.
Mhm.
Do you find that there's like a lot of resistance? Like let's say like when you train like students or maybe someone who's like maybe of a different political affiliation who maybe aren't on board with some of these philosophies, maybe I mean maybe they're just like actively hostile, but maybe they're more like just kind of like in a general sense, more like what happened to good old like color blindness of like
Yeah, yeah,
are we like
absolutely.
poking at this wound and like are we making it worse? I'm just kind of stating some of the things that people might say where it's like instead of like having just like purely merit, or having people apply and not know, like because it seemed like that was the goal, but then it like shifted and now it's much more maybe complicated, maybe for good reason, a little more complicated, like you said, of where these things intersection versus just not dealing with it. Or I don't know, what do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. You see that all the time, right? So, there's one thing to think about pure merit and just merit alone, based on however and whatever criteria one thinks is meritable, right? So you have that. Um, and then, there's the question of, okay, well, who and what gets to define what qualifies as merit or meritable? And how do you weigh that, right? So I can honestly tell you, had some really challenging conversation just around that in and of itself. Like, what if you just think about, for instance, you're hiring for a position, and here's all the criteria and all of the qualifications that we want to have uh, for an individual filling this position. And then you kind of go through that list, and you have to ask yourself, okay, give me an example of why a person would need this number of years of experience to do this job, right? And that becomes a challenging question. Um, and so as you start to really get into some of those kinds of nuances, what you're really asking folks to do, which can be problematic. I'll be honest, which really can be problematic. You're asking folks to interrogate what and how they assess, and what and how they place value on, and why, which can be really disconcerting.
That's what I was telling you before is like, I'm just like, I feel like some of these are just such complicated problems. And I hear like maybe arguments on different sides and like I understand and I don't even know what to make of it sometimes, and I don't even know if there's always a great answer because I think we like try to oversimplify things and try to look at things as black and white and here's the right answer. Like let's just take like a hypothetical situation where let's say I have like a group of applicants, right? Now I'm an employer like on a small scale, and these are thoughts that I've like had to have, right? So it's like personally, I see a huge value, especially in like the mental health space, given my clientele, a diversity of people, like having a diversity of let's say therapists who work for me in different backgrounds is just such a value. It's like it's very clear cut, right? Now, now let's say I'm trying to hire for a therapist. I don't even know if therapist is always like the best. Well, let's go with it. So let's say I'm trying to find a therapist. I really want someone who's um, trauma informed, or they have like certain like very
Mhm.
objective credentials, right? Or maybe it's like you're a computer programmer or something like that, and like they need to know like Java 2 years of this. I don't know about any of that stuff,
Mhm.
right? So let's say, I only have so much control, let's say, as an employer, of like who applies to my jobs and who responds to my outreach, right? Let's say it's like both ways. And not everyone is a great recruiter, and companies don't always know what to do. But let's say I have like 5 applicants and or let's just say like 2 applicants to make it simple. And this one person has more experience in JavaScript and like these very objective measures. However, I do want that diversity. And there is someone of a more, and we got like more intersection or comes from like a more marginalized background, that I think there's value there. Like, where is the balance? Like, what, like, how much should that be weighed? How much should the diversity piece be weighed versus like just the pure cold fact of like this person being able to do this specific job? I just don't know the answer.
I think that brings into uh, consideration a couple of other things, but for the most part, I would say as a premise, diversity, inclusion, equity, and some of the other words that are used as it relates to should never should never be placed above the quality of the candidate, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So, you don't hire a black candidate if they're not qualified, right? So that isn't the purpose of diversity. It's not the goal is to give somebody who's not qualified a job just for the sake of getting them a job, right? Which sometimes folks will kind of throw that out there. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, how do you and this again becomes the challenging piece. How do you think about the role? How do you think about the job, right? And and how does that play into the culture of your organization, and what you want the culture of your organization or your team or your department to be? Um, a lot of people, still to this day, really prefer homogeneity, right? They want folks who think like them. They want folks who look like them, who have the same experiences, and they believe, that helps them as a department or as a team. Obviously, data and studies show otherwise, but they still believe that. And so it becomes a matter of how do you think and how do you feel about adding difference to, your organization, your department, your team, and what value does that bring in a really substantive way to what you're trying to accomplish as an organizational mission and who you're trying to serve, right? So obviously we know the landscape of society is changing. So we are becoming more in the direction of persons of color. And so what does that mean? What are the implications for organizations and their staffing, right? And, what does that mean to be more reflective of some of those changing demographics within society? So I think there are other like components that kind of come into that question, but I think really what you're getting at is exactly how, I think DEI efforts kind of get characterized negatively, is that, you're telling me to hire, this person kind of when I have a more qualified person over here that you're telling me not to hire because they're not in a minority class or they don't represent, one of those different kinds of groups. And that's not what quality DEI efforts are about, right? Quality DEI efforts are about how do you think about providing opportunities for groups that historically may not have had those opportunities, and what does that mean in terms of providing support as well, but then also realizing that there's value in that, right? And there is.
That's really interesting to hear you say that because I think that does get caricaturized, or maybe it straw mans the argument of, the DEI or like, even something like, like an anti-racism lens, intersectionality lens, where I know that there's this philosophy of if the outcome is not as such, or there's like equity, then there is something wrong with the system. So like, let's say like, yeah, for that example of like, okay, yeah, I mean, I mean, I'm not going to hire someone, or I shouldn't hire someone just based on like who they are in the intersection. Um, but like, would you say too, let's say I have the two candidates, but it's like pretty close. It's like, this person has 2 years experience, this person has 1 year experience. Where do I still, is it just that objective where it's like pure colorblind, whatever merit, where it's like, and I have like an interesting kind of anecdote that I heard. Maybe I'll throw it in there just before I have you answer this. But I heard from like Neil deGrasse Tyson, and he said something that really kind of hit me, and it was something that I kind of believed before, when it's like, where does the role of someone's upbringing
Mhm.
play in someone's disadvantage? Because like what he said is like, often in cases, like let's say you have two people applying to college, right, in that same, where this person has more extracurriculars, or this, they have like
Mhm.
a slightly better GPA, or they were in higher classes. However, it's not about that person's marks or achievement. It's about this other person who maybe came from a more like disadvantaged background. This is how they performed in their environment, right? They kind of rose to the top as valedictorian, or got this certain GPA, but they did it despite all these obstacles. So what does that say about their character or their ability to perform in this job,
Sure.
versus the person who grew up and had every single advantage and have all the
Mhm.
marks? So like, yeah, where, I guess that's like, where do you weigh that? If like you got someone 2 years experience, but they got, less of a diverse background,
Yeah.
how do you weigh that variable? Is it 10%?
Yeah. No, I mean that's a really good example, and I think what that speaks to is how how are we as employers or institutions, et cetera, how are we taking into account the entire person, right? And so as you weigh, whatever some of those variables are, how are you making sure, in addition to those variables, you're weighing other variables or other aspects equally or just as much? So if it's, yeah, I really would like a person who has 2 years experience at this level, but this person has 3 years experience at this level, and I'm pretty sure, pretty confident that it wouldn't take much for them to step up to this level and hit the ground running, right? How are you having those types of conversations, and how are you expanding the thinking behind, you know, that criteria setting, or, those kinds of things? Because historically, what has happened, there's been such a hard line drawn at some of those, criteria, or some of those requirements, or some of those qualifications, that uh, that's how many folks have been excluded intentionally, right? And so you hold a hard stance on some of these requirements when they really aren't necessarily that necessary, and they aren't, that quote unquote required in that sense, so it's kind of stepping away from coming up with constructs to exclude, and thinking about ways to include or be a little bit more open in different ways.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's just like my like very logical brain like wants an answer of like 15% or something.
Yeah.
It just
Well,
doesn't work. That it just doesn't work
yeah,
that
it
way.
doesn't work like that, but I think what you're getting at, which I totally vibe with, is, how do I hold myself accountable, right? And if it's 15%, then fine, it's 15%. If it's 5%, then fine, it's 5%. I I just I know that as a society we kind of focus on those types of things, whereas, you know I tend to think, if we're providing space for the engagement and the opportunity to explore, some of those things will happen naturally
For sure.
because you're thinking about them differently.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think in metaphors a lot, and I see a connection here with so and I, s- so I work with a lot of like families with addiction, and and they are mental health, and they have kids who, just say kids or a brother or sister who just like struggles with addiction. They're in and out of treatment, or they refuse to go to treatment, and they say, well, how do I engage with, like, how much leeway do I give them? They relapse, or they're just like not finding a job. And I just like came up with this like out of nowhere at the top of my head, where it's like, I think I call it the 15 to 20 rule, which is like giving them 15 to 20% more like patience, support, and understanding than you normally would, because they're someone who struggles with, mental health, with addiction, and they may need just a little bit more to get to that point. However, if you go more than 20%, then that actually may have a negative impact, where you may be like, again, this is just my world, like you're enabling, or you're maybe allowing this to continue by being too soft. But then if you go like too hard, or you're too just like, you need to like be exact, you're not meeting them where they're at. You need to be exactly, you have to meet this criteria of behavior and this, or we're cutting you
Yeah.
off and we're not helping. Like, it
Mhm.
seems like there's like a balance in there as well, where you like don't want to hire the person who's just like not qualified just because of their intersectionality. Um,
Mhm.
but also you want to have a little bit of wiggle room there, but not just, but it sounds like, and I like this, not just to um, weigh it for the sake of intersectionality's sake, but saying like, no, this is an actual strength, and this person may very well do just as well as this other person, because this is actually a variable that shows like, they ran the race, they didn't get as good a score, but they had rocks in their backpack,
Sure.
and like
Sure. Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
something to be said about that.
Yeah. And again, thinking about some of those intangibles, right? Um, and allowing those intangibles to come into the conversation just as much as we create space for the tangibles, right? So, it does become kind of this healthy mix of, thinking about, what a person has done, but then also, the conditions or the circumstances under which, the person has done those things,
So
and being able to talk about that.
for sure. And so would you say like, so let's say like I have my company, right?
Mhm.
Or let's say a school, like let's say you have Hamlin, or I don't know, just any example of an institution, right? That like really like they want this to be, they want to have diversity, they want to have equity, they want to include, they want all of that, but just the recruiting, maybe just the people, they're just not there. Like the candidates are not there.
Mhm.
They can't find them. They're not applying. And then you just look at the outside, and I think there would be people who criticize, say, look, your institution is a lily white. You're doing something wrong. Like
Mhm.
you're being like either blatantly like racist, or there's like a systemic issue in your institution, just based merely on the fact that there is an unequal outcome.
Mhm.
Right. I mean, I guess I don't know my question, but I don't know. I see a lot of that, and
Yeah.
I can see like both sides of like outcome versus like, hey, I'm really trying here,
Right, right. And again, I think that's where, you can have some of those healthy conversations around just that in and of itself. Here are our results. Here are our processes, right? How are the two connected, right? And how do we think about, and this is where I think system change is so important, right? How do we think about system change or systems change in a way that we can affect the kinds of results and outcomes that we want? And going into the mechanism or the systemic nature of some of that stuff, whether it is policy, whether it is process, or whether it even is, in some level, some of those practices, how are we peeling back the onion, so to speak, on some of those kinds of institutional systemic things that might be contributing to the results that we see or the outcomes that we have, which is the huge debate, when you start talking about, the equity gaps, whether it's achievement gaps, whether it's health disparities, whether it's, some of those other kinds of things, right? It's how are we actually, thinking about some of these structures and systems in ways that allow us to really interrogate them and hopefully change them, that can lead to better outcomes and better results.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think like, and I think I maybe have that bias, or just because, like, I don't know, I don't like watch a lot of news, but I'm like, I like hearing some of the public discourse about, but like, there's a lot of yelling going on. And, and like, I'm kind of, and I'm like scared because like, so like, like in my world, right, of mental health, right, there's been this like huge push, and I think a lot of it obviously for the better, but like I've seen like some conversations in like a Facebook group of social workers, right, who will take some of these principles, right, whether it's like anti-racism, some of these more like postmodern contemporary views of these things, and maybe someone says something that like kind of seems innocuous, but then someone like finds a reason or a way that this doesn't align with that, and it turns into this like, I don't know, like people like
Firestorm.
online bullying, and
Yeah.
like, and I like may bring up some like examples and see your thought on it, but it just seems like a lot of people like live in fear of not doing these things right, or being labeled or
Yeah.
criticized,
Yeah.
where it's like, yeah, maybe they don't have a master's or PhD in like a liberal art gender study or something like
Mhm.
that, where because a lot of it's like very complicated, like some of the rules, and I don't know what my question
Yeah.
is, but it's just like a lot of,
No, but I mean, that's a really good point because there are folks who, because of their fear, anxiety, apprehension of being labeled or misconstrued or misunderstood, who won't step into that space of addressing something or attempting something or speaking to something, which is really sad, but it's really true. It's a reality. One of the things that I constantly talk about is, we have to get away from this binary of right and wrong, right? We have to get away from this, either you agree with me or you don't agree with me, right? We have to get away from those types of rigid binaries because I think understanding is better than agreement. So how can we operate from this mindset of understanding and shift away from this mindset of agreement or this mindset of right versus wrong? Because whether I agree with you or not, if I understand where you're coming from, or I understand why you feel the way that you feel, or what's contributing to how you see things or how you have experienced the world, I'm in a better place to still stay connected with you because I understand you. It's not based on whether I agree with you or not. It's rooted in the fact that I understand where you're coming from because I took the time to connect with that and to delve into that versus just shunning you because you said something that I didn't like or that I didn't agree with.
I'm someone who like, I consider myself to be a liberal. I
Mhm.
consider myself someone who believes in a lot, like just about everything you're saying, right? About it, like the
Mhm.
strength of diversity, that this is necessary, that there needs to be some change to balance inequities, right? So like, I believe like a lot of these underlying principles, but like over the last few years, and I started to see this maybe around 2014, 15, when I went to grad school for like social work, which is like, and learning a lot of these things. I'm like, oh yeah, this makes a lot of sense. And, but then I've seen, I don't know, I've been like mortified from what I've seen like out of some of my peers and what I've been seeing in the greater public conversation, um because like I'm someone who like I really believe in like healthy debate and communication and persuasion, just and so like what's been really sad for me to see is that a lot of that behavior of like yelling, and it's like it's both sides, like yelling at each other, like whether it's from intersectional side of things, or the we don't need to pay attention to this, or even worse on the right side, that kind of what my side has been doing on the left has really pushed a lot of people away, locked them down, put them in fear. They feel excluded from the camp of conversation, right? Um,
Yeah.
and that's really hardened this side. And then you see things like the rise, like in this, I could be wrong, but like, like the rise of like Donald Trump, or these characters like a Jordan Peterson type character, like some of these people come up that like push against it. And you have these people that are like, love it because they feel so demeaned or like meant to feel shame. Um,
Mhm.
it's just from a communication standpoint, like in speaking with you, like I don't feel that way like at all. Like you see, like you're someone who like comes to it with like balance and a calmness and like a someone who could walk a middle path in a gray area. But yeah, I don't know what my question is, but it just I don't know.
Yeah,
It's just
but I think that is a larger societal problem, right? We don't know how to talk to each other. We don't. I mean, there is yelling, there is, screaming, there is, condemnation, there is critique, there is, people staying in their bunkers and doubling down, right? There's all of that everywhere. It's so pervasive. Um, which makes efforts and work around this particular area that much more difficult and challenging, as in other areas. I mean, even when you start to think, I don't know, how old I don't know how old you are, so I apologize. But
30.
I remember growing up, during the crack epidemic, right? And there was huge condemnation around, the crack user, but there was no condemnation around the supplier or how the drugs got into communities or thinking about it in that way. And like I said earlier, I was a product of a teenage mom, right? And so, even in the 70s, there was huge condemnation around, black women having children out of wedlock, right? And so, in thinking about that in terms of, condemning the individual, right? And condemning the reality of the individual and that child or, that situation, but not really thinking about resources or not really thinking about, all of those, community realities that plagued and continue to plague, urban areas in some regards, right? And so again, it's more to me, how do you expand the conversation as to go back to my earlier point, how do you expand the conversation that can bring in other variables and other dynamics that might help uh, folks see some things differently that maybe they wouldn't normally see or hear. And that's where I think, a lot of me and my constituents kind of sit in our roles is because, we're asking folks and institutions and organizations to maybe think about some things a little bit differently than maybe, they historically have.
Yeah, and I think like taking that approach is something that builds empathy. And I think that especially with our online culture, there's a
Mhm.
lot of like very, I think like a lot of it, like even on both sides, like very antisocial behavior of like
Mhm.
internet bullying. And like, both sides like think it's like righteous, where it's like, well, if you disagree with me on the left, then you're on the side of the system or the oppressor,
Yep.
you're
Yeah.
raising your
Yep.
this.
Yep.
And then if you're here, you're like, liberal, like blah, 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 whatever,
Mhm.
insert name here. And I just find that like, I think there's so much less of a gap than what we think there is. Like if we're able to have these calm, like,
Totally
like
agree.
tell everyone like
Yeah.
calm the fuck
Totally agree.
down.
Yeah.
Like,
Totally agree.
even though, but then like the other side say, oh, calm the fuck down. Well, look what's going on. Look what's going on in these urban areas. And you're telling me to calm down. It's like, no, 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 no. Like you're correct. There's a lot of horrible shit going on, but by approaching it in this way and having this level of dialogue, you're actually making the problem worse. You're hardening
Mhm.
the other side who you actually may need to get the votes or to be on board in the society. Like we have to have some agreement on it. And yeah, again, it just like it makes me like pretty sad to see because I really think let's say you took like a Trump person. And I've had like clients who are and like almost just like as a thought experiment or like because I'm actually like writing a book on this like about communication and like
Mhm.
healthy persuasion and support and like dealing with like difficult folks. And like one of the things I talk about is like just that importance of empathy and to like sit down and have a one-on-one conversation. Like, for example, if you sat down with like a Trumper or something that, and I probably even shouldn't call him that, you know, it's like derogatory in a way, but like someone who is a fan of Donald Trump or something like that, and you sat down who has opposing views and you just said like, here's my experience. Here's where I came from, or I grew up with a single mother. Here's some of the obstacles that I faced. Here's some of the race or whatever that situation was. That person, I think, would, their defenses would melt down. Just like when I'm dealing with a client, like doing an intervention or something on a person who's like, I don't want to change. I don't need help. Right. They have their
Absolutely.
walls up.
Yeah.
I can't
Yeah.
change them. But if I say, I understand where you're at, I understand why you believe here. And then they could start talking about that, you know?
Yeah. We used to have some really great conversations around uh, Ronald Reagan and his presidency and Reaganomics. A lot of us, who grew up and saw some of the realities of his policies. Um, and one of the interesting things that I totally agree with what you're saying, you know, back then it was easier to have some of those conversations because folks were a little bit more willing to engage, and it wasn't so combative,
Yeah.
right? And it wasn't so uh confrontational in terms of, I don't agree with you, so you're wrong, cancel, get out of my face,
Yeah.
that kind of deal. It was really, I think a genuine exercise of exploration, which you don't see much these days. You don't see much at all, unfortunately.
Is cancel culture real?
Oh, it absolutely is. Oh my God. Oh yeah. In every way, it absolutely is. Um, I think it's unfortunate, but it absolutely is.
Well, I hear on the left, of people who like espouse some of these beliefs, like it's not real. Like this is just justice. Like
Mhm.
and I'm someone on the left. I'm like, no, it is real. Like, and it's freaky, and I understand why. And I'm like, I'm glad I run my own businesses, but again, you could have your reputation ruined, and that's what I'm saying. There's just this like climate of fear, and I think like to have these conversations, and I mean, and I could just tell you, like, I'll be like super honest, like as a white dude and like who has friends who are like, well-meaning liberal, like a lot of people are like kind of afraid of this, and they're afraid to like push against it, and they just kind of, I think there's people that really are like firebrand, like they believe in all this like wholeheartedly. Then I think there's like people kind of like me who like believe in this but like kind of have some criticisms about the extreme.
Mhm.
And then I think you have some people who like just go along with it out of fear. And so I think, yeah, so I mean, just like I know, like a lot of my friends who I know like are on board with like the underlying principles and want that equity, but are just like don't like what's going on our own side and like live in a state of fear.
Yeah, and I've had people say that to me, in different ways, right? David, I want to do the right thing, but I'm scared that it might not come out the right way, right? Or really fearful that it might not be understood the way that I wanted, that I'm hoping that it will. Because of that, I choose to stay away from it, or I choose to avoid it, or I choose to, just kind of keep my head down, and so yeah, all of that is real. But I do think, kind of what you alluded to earlier, I do think we have to get to a point where everybody's talking to one another. I really do. Um, Unfortunately, I don't know how to make that happen or how that would look. If I did, I'd probably run for president or something. I don't know. But I do think we have to get to a point where folks are talking to each other. Um, and that I think the more that doesn't happen, the more risk we run of staying in our extremeness, which I think can be kind of dangerous.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And you see this with like politicians and like a couple of politicians I like or admire. I think like a good example would be, I don't know, someone like an Eric Adams in New York or like an Andrew
Mhm.
Yang or someone who's all like, we need to have these conversations, right? Who are like calm and can like bring like kind of like people who could like bring both sides together. Because for me, I just look at things from more of a communication standpoint.
Yep. Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
and yes, I mean, that's really cool to hear because, like, like, and I'll be honest too, like, I don't know, like real talk, but like, I've like wanted to have this conversation for a while, but like, I did have some like fear coming into it, like,
Mhm.
oh, what if I say the wrong thing? Or like, I don't know. I mean, I think just because of
Yeah.
that just heightened, I'm like, like, I'm afraid to have these conversations, but like, I really want to.
But again, I think, it to get to a level of understanding, even if you don't agree, can be such a powerful way to engage, right? And regardless of what the difference is or what the differences are, um, if you're approaching, that engagement opportunity as a way to learn or as a way to understand, and you're sincere about that, I think chances are you'll get much more out of it than if you are approaching it from the standpoint of, you know, agreement or disagreement.
And that's why I really like conversations like this where it's one on one, because I think it's there's so much more empathy and understanding that gets built, and you take away this idea of like I'm scoring points for my side and my peers, like this mob mentality,
Mhm.
that I think is a real problem. Where it's like I think people try to find things that people do wrong, to so it's like
Yeah.
performative. Like, and I was looking it up.
And that's why I say cancel culture is real because people do that, right? People cherry pick things uh to then say, aha, got you, right? And that's a social reality right now, which scares, people from doing some of the things that you said.
Well, yeah, and I think that makes people, and because the thing is like, okay, you have the other side. They completely disagree with you. They don't even want to hear you. Then you have some people who would be sympathetic to you if you approach them in a nice way. But then you have people on your side who are afraid of you. And it's like, there's only this really small sliver, and you've pushed everyone away. And even the people that are just to the left of you are afraid, right? And they don't want to deal with it. They don't even want to like go into that world because it's like they're walking on eggshells in a landmine field. And like, so it pushes them away, then they're less likely to engage in or like engage with
Yeah.
like DEI or like some of these more intersectional concepts that are important to
Mhm.
talk about. And I'll give you like one example. Again, my inner like fear comes out, but like, um, one, he's got these like culture war topics, right?
Mhm.
And so, like, one of them recently, still going on, but, is kind of the issue of, like, say, transgender men, or I'm sorry, transgender females in sports, right? And everyone's going back and forth. And, like, this is something that I literally didn't understand. So I have a friend who is a trans man. And I was like, oh, I'm going to try to engage with this. So I said, because, I literally don't understand. And I said something like, hey, like, from my perspective, like, or at least like, I'm trying to understand your perspective, but it does seem like that there would be like an inherent unfair advantage to a trend, like based on their genetic makeup and da 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 da, like that it could be a problem if it, whatever, right? And I like really said, hey, I would love to hear your perspective. Tell me where I'm wrong. I love engaging. Like, tell me where I'm wrong here. And I got like, I mean, there was like a thread of people who were like, how could you even think that? Like, and it just like, it got so great. And I was like, I was afraid to even say it. But then I'm like, oh, well, my fear is justified. Like, I couldn't have that conversation because I
Mhm.
got just lambasted. And then it made me want to be more like, F you, like I
Mhm.
really tried here.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know.
But see, that's that again, when when they're when someone expresses a willingness to be vulnerable, right? To
Yeah.
ask the question or to engage, there has to be some level of uh, empathic reception to that, right? And so you aren't driving the person away because they asked the question, or you aren't, you know, really, tearing the person down because, they didn't know something, or, whatever the case may be. Um, but again, that's why, I think I could be wrong, but that's why I think that cancel culture stuff is real, because
You're
it's
not
not about, it's really not about educating someone. It's really not about, helping someone understand anymore. It's all about aha moments, gotcha, and, raising, the ire of other folks against you because you said something, or because you thought, or because you didn't know something, right? And so all of that becomes super prevalent, um, both in the moment and how we approach the moment, which causes, like you said, a lot of people to say, yeah, not going to do it.
that happen where students like come up and like like evergreen. I don't know. There's like a lot of those. Like, what do you tell students? Because I mean, especially liberal arts schools, I would imagine like a very high percentage of them are coming with that attitude, that firebrand, and like for me to even say, given my demographic, to say that cancel culture is a thing, they're like, "Oh, you're just a conservative."
No, well, I think for many students across the board, in higher ed in general, they do come to campuses with, tons of, expectations that maybe, when we were in school, we didn't necessarily, step on to campuses with. Um, and I think that's a huge benefit though, right? And I think empowering students to think, challenging students to interrogate and be critical, uh, creating spaces where, they can engage and should engage, and grow and expand, are all super, super, super beneficial, not just while they're on our college campuses, but when they step into workspaces and work environments. How broad is their thinking? How adaptable are they when they get into, some of these workspaces? How can they lead? And what skill sets do they have based on, the college experience? So I think all of those are super important. Where I think, higher ed in general kind of falls into this trap of, you know, how does that look, right? How do we do it? And for some, doing it, really takes the form of a draconian, antiquated model of, I'm the professor and, you're the student. Whereas, I think in some instances, that can be so helpful, right? Because that's critical. But then in other instances, how do we think about, the space and the learning environment as shared, right? Where everyone can learn from everyone. And it doesn't necessarily have to be kind of this, top down, or this positional power versus one who doesn't have positional power kinds of things.
No, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I mean, I just wish that, you know, do you see that like within DEI professionals who take more of that, um, less of an attitude like you and more of like an authoritarian type, like, no, this is it. This is the intersectionality. You
I,
bow down.
I think, yeah, I think I've seen that play out more, perhaps in like workshops, or,
Okay.
kinds of, plenary sessions where, somebody might be, presenting on a topic, and, all of a sudden a question comes that might be, a dissenting voice, and as it relates to that topic, and the presenter doesn't necessarily handle it with the type of respect and grace in terms of a conversation. So I've seen that play out, um, but I've never actually seen a person in a role, be that hardcore or rigid in terms of, helping the institution, or at least attempting to help the institution advance in some ways.
Yeah.
because you really can't. I mean, most of us, if not all of us, we have to be collaborative in our roles because we depend on other areas for support. So, we have to be collaborative and we have to be, kind of, relationship builders and, all of those kinds of things to help the institution accomplish certain things.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. It makes a lot of sense. I think that's some of the, just blanket criticisms of like, oh, some of these DEI efforts, like in workplaces, actually like kind of push people away, or they make them less
Mhm.
interested, or at the very least, it just they sit through it and it doesn't persuade them. You
Yep.
have a huge investment, which probably on its face is a very good thing, like just an amount of dollars spent towards DEI efforts at companies. But a lot of that, I think, people may do it disingenuously or like out
Mhm.
of fear, or they're trying to score. Look, look what we're doing. We're bringing all this in. And I think that's another criticism too, where it's like a lot of people are just doing this to score points or just are doing it.
Yeah. And that's where you have to ask the question, is it leading to change? And if it is leading to change, where and how? And if it isn't, then why isn't it? And then how do we rethink what we're doing? So yeah, I think um, some of it can be super performative, right? With no results. And some of it can be, you know, less performative and really intentional and have powerful results, right? So it all depends on, where and how, some of those structural kinds of things can also be dismantled in ways that allow for change to happen. So, you know, you can't, well, I personally don't think that you can totally avoid, folks who, do the go through the DEI trainings or whatever, just to go through it because they have to, and it doesn't really make a difference on them or to them. You're not going to avoid that. Right. Um, there's just going to be people who have that outlook. But again, what are you doing in addition to that? Right. So, yep, you might not be able to change this individual, but how can you help the institution change?
No, right on. Yeah, I completely agree with that as well. That that just if it's not done in a genuine way, it's just probably not going to yield that results. And if it's done, based in fear, not out of a genuine interest, but at the same time, like, where's the balance? It just like has to
Mhm.
be done. So I think even too, like I have friends who work out like kind of out in Silicon Valley and like that whole world, and there's just
Yeah.
such an emphasis on it. But it seems like some of it at least is out of fear, and people like like a lot of professors have that complaint now, like in academia, like they're like afraid of their students, right, because of that like call out and the cancel culture. There's many instances of folks getting fired, but also kind of that joke of like slacktivism, or like what you see at institutions like the New York Times, where people have been brought on for like diverse viewpoints, like politically, and they just leave because it's like, this is just like a, homogeneous thought,
Mhm.
thought process. There's no room for those conversations. Um, and yeah, it seems to be an issue, like for example, and I was curious just like kind of get your case on some of these again, if you're comfortable like talking about it, but like, like back in the day, there was that like, about that, there's that James Damore. Do you know what I'm talking about, that case?
Mm, Not
No.
off the top of no.
So he was a worker for Google, and he wrote this like letter, um, pushing back on the idea that like somewhere like Google was like systemically like oppressing women or something like that because there wasn't a lot of female software engineers. But he kind of wrote this like dissenting article being like, well, that's more due to like a lack of interest versus like someone like Google like discriminating or something. And he got fired, and it was this like whole issue. And it's kind of like what we had talked about before of, where how much, do you weigh merit, or how much of it is an institutional problem versus like an individual bias problem? Do you not remember that one didn't hit your
I
brain
don't
hard?
remember that, but I will say, um, even though I'm not familiar with specifics, you have to make room for those conversations though. As tough as they may be, you know, still having them is helpful, and I think healthy.
Yeah, and I mean, he was someone too. It's kind of like early as like 2017 where he got just blanket fired. When that email went out. Um, One of the things I wanted to talk about because of right now what's happening with like kind of and we think we hit some of the points on that, but like what you're seeing with affirmative action being under that may very well be removed. Um, and then you're seeing like a lot of this with college admissions, where you're having, these tough conversations. You're also seeing it like in some of these like specialized high schools and like charter schools or even the public schools that are like for gifted children, and the criticisms on them for not being more inclusive. I guess maybe we covered a little bit, like, well, where do you strike that balance of,
Yeah. Again, I think having the conversations are always helpful and healthy. Um, but I also think too, just the eradication of something doesn't necessarily mean that's the answer either,
yeah,
right? And so, how do you think about both? Again, I'm a huge proponent of both and constructs, right? And versus either or constructs.
yeah.
So how do you think about both, right? So if affirmative action is the issue or is the quote unquote problem, then how do you think about that in terms of revamping, revising so it isn't as problematic versus the total eradication or removal of it? And if you can start there in the thought process and the conversation, that might lead to better ways to create a better structure that can help, still a number of people in significant ways.
Do you think the way we've done affirmative action is the most effective?
I think it was historically and needed to be. Um, but as with all processes, um, you know, how it might be applied or misapplied can also be a factor too, right? So again, thinking about it holistically, I absolutely think it's been super beneficial and helpful. Um, but I can see where an argument might be, well, it really wasn't super beneficial and helpful for all of us, right? For society as a whole. Um, Particularly if you start to draw lines of identity, really rigid lines of identity, based on whatever, which, for many of us, particularly those of us who fall within some of those identity lines, you know, we needed that type of assistance. We needed that type of help. We needed that type of opportunity because historically we weren't getting some of those opportunities. So yeah, I absolutely do. Um, does that mean, as with any other policy, that we shouldn't revisit it and rethink it over the course of however many years? Absolutely not. Let's think about making it better. Let's think about making it more practical or applicable. But that doesn't necessarily mean we should just go right to the removal of it either, just for the sake of you know removing it.
What would be like, let's say you had your magic wand, what would be like a few ways to make it more effective and or appropriate for where we're at right now? Like, what would be your recommendation?
Well, the first thing I would start with is how people understand it in general, right? So usually, uh, most folks associate affirmative action to quotas, and if you fundamentally believe that affirmative action is about a quota or quotas, um, you could then think, oh yeah, well then it's damaging just as much as it's helping. But that's not the only thing that affirmative action is about, right? There's so many other uh, aspects to it. And how do you think about candidate pools? How do you think about applicant pools? How do you think about all of these other kinds of ways that create access to folks or create access for folks that really wouldn't happen if we didn't have something systemic in place to make sure it happens.
Yeah.
That's where I think we could have, a really constructive conversation, at least to start with.
Yeah, I mean, so the other big, thing with the Supreme Court is, however you want to look at it, but it's like, the discrimination of Harvard and one of the other schools, I forget what it was, of being excluded, based on kind of like a quota system of being like, there's too many Asian, and so there, a lot of pushback. And you kind of saw some similar things. I don't know if it was maybe California, New York, with some of those specialized, gifted schools where kids weren't getting in, or, because of their demographic. And it kind of brought up things like Jews, were kind of excluded in a similar way, back in the day. Like, what's your thought on that? I mean, because like these things are so complicated, and I guess I know there's not.
But see, and they are complicated, and I think there's the other side too that we can talk about, or can be brought up. How many people are admitted who don't necessarily credentially deserve to be admitted, but relationally, they're admitted because of. So I mean, having the conversation and focusing on one aspect of it, I think does a disservice as well, right? So that's the whole systems change piece, right? How do you think about the system in its entirety, right? Versus one piece of it or one aspect of it. And that doesn't mean at some point you don't hone in on an aspect to change, but how do you still think about it holistically?
Yeah, Dr. Everett, thanks so much for your time. This was like super. I'll start that.
You are more than welcome, and I apologize. I should have said that sooner, so I'm sorry. I
Oh
promise.
no, it's fine. No, I mean, we kind of hit all the things I wanted to hit, but yeah,
Okay.
I just want to thank you for your time. Like, any parting thoughts, or like any literature recommendations or something for our audience that would be beneficial for them to get your message out?
Recommendations from me. Wow. I would suggest that folks, um, really invest some time into some tools, right? So I had mentioned the IDI, the Intercultural Development Inventory earlier, doing that. Um, maybe even the IAT, the Implicit Association Test. Excuse me, Implicit IAT, whatever the A stands for, I can't remember, but it helps you, uh, you know, recognize and work on, some of your, or at least, the recognition piece of, your biases. So I would just encourage folks to invest in tools like that. And even, even if you like to read, and even if you, have an interest in picking up some of those types of resources, kind of starting with some of that personal stuff, I think gives you a really good lens to begin reading, some of those resources that you might delve into. So that would probably be my
Yeah.
suggestion for folks.
Awesome. Well, yeah, maybe you could shoot me some links or something. I'll put it in the show notes for everyone and
Okay.
go from there. Well, all right, Dr. Everett, thank you so much.